Started. Okay, so we're going to be looking at an interesting mitzvah. This is the mitzvah of carrying the aron on our shoulders. So in the Mishkan and in the Beis Hamikdash, there was an aron kodesh. It wasn't like the aron kodesh that we have in shul, per se. It was sort of a smaller ark, and it had 2 poles on it. Right, the ark had 2 poles that were inserted through rings on the side, and you could pick the aron up by holding onto the poles. Right, if you held onto the poles and picked them up, and then put the poles on your shoulder, you could walk with the aron that way. And the mitzvah, it seems to be, without giving away the ending here, it would seem to be that the mitzvah is to carry this aron on one's shoulders. Right, that's the positive command of the Torah, that the aron is to be placed on the shoulders. Seems like a interesting mitzvah. Doesn't seem like one of the fundamental mitzvahs of the Torah here, but a mitzvah nonetheless. And let's see what great chachma there is in the mechanics of this mitzvah. Okay, so if we look here at the psukim, right? So the psukim talk about the mitzvah, and the mitzvah is applicable to the bnei kahat, right? So if you look in the first source here, it says bnei kahat lo nasan ki avodos hakodesh shalem v'katef Yisrael, right? So they should, the descendants of Kahat, which were the tribe of Levi, they kept it on their shoulders. Okay, that they should put it on. In Sefer Yoshua, right, we see that V'yomer Yoshua Cohanim, right? The Yoshua commands the Cohanim specifically, not just the Bnei Kahat anymore, but the Cohanim to carry it on their shoulders. And Rashi explains that Ad achshav nasu levvim vayom Cohanim, that until this point, the Leviim were the ones that carried it. Right, so throughout the desert until the Jews get to the Jordan River, so until that point, the Leviim were the ones that carried it. All of a sudden, in Sefer Yoshua, things change, and now the Cohanim are the ones that carry it. So our first question was, why the change? Why all of a sudden the switch from the Leviim to the Cohanim? Okay. When we look at the Rambam and how he says the mitzvah, I list the mitzvah here in the Sefer Hamitzvos. So he says Hamitzvah Lamadal, the 34th mitzvah. He should sivanu shiso hakohanim haaron al ktafeim, right? That when wanting to move the aron from place to place, so the kohanim are the ones that put it on their shoulders. Right? Who Amar Yisrael, and it quotes our pasuk. Okay, and then the Rambam says something interesting. He says that even though the mitzvah is for the kohanim to do this, it used to be the Leviim did it. Why did the Leviim do this? Because there weren't enough Cohanim. Okay, so that seems logistically like a good reason, right? Doesn't seem like there's anything too strange about that logistically, except for the fact that we don't have things like that in the Torah. When there's a mitzvah to do something, so you have 2 situations. You have that the mitzvah can be done, and then the mitzvah is done the way it's supposed to be done, or the mitzvah can't be done, and then you're anus, right? So then at that point, then you can't fulfill the mitzvah. So if a Jewish community doesn't have a shofar, and the Jew doesn't have the ability to get a shofar, and then comes Rosh Hashanah, so it's not like we say, okay, this year they didn't have a shofar, so they took out a trombone. Somebody had a trombone, and they blew a trombone. That's how they fulfill the mitzvah. Why they use a trombone? Because they didn't have a shofar. So it doesn't seem like there's any mechanism.
And this is different.
What?
This is different than the attitude of a bidiyah.
No, so
there are many mitzvahs that we're supposed to do on a chatchilu level.
No. So then you say that. Okay, so but 1 second. That's a possible mechanism, right? But I'm saying, but when we have a mitzvah in the Torah, so the mitzvah has a specific way of fulfilling the mitzvah, right? We have a specific way of fulfilling the mitzvah, and the way we fulfill the mitzvah is the way it's listed in the Torah. That's how we fulfill the mitzvah. Now, if there's a possibility of in the case of X, then we do Y, so then that should be listed. But there has to be a mechanism that allows for substitution, right? It's not like there's always a mechanism that allows for substitution. And it doesn't seem like from the way the Rambam lists it here that there is a mechanism for substitution, right? And how would a mechanism for substitution work? Where would we have such a thing that if you can't do X, then you do Y? So then X and Y have to both be part of the mitzvah, right? They both have to be part of the mitzvah. So for instance, when it comes to shofar, so the mitzvah is a shofar. It's not producing a loud shofar-like sound, right? The mitzvah is to produce the sound that comes out of a shofar. So therefore, there's no such thing as ideal and less than ideal. There's the mitzvah and not the mitzvah, right? So whenever you have a situation where you're going to suggest b'diavad, then what you have to first suggest, right? B'diavad and l'chachila are ideal, and then in a situation where the ideal can't be achieved, post facto, you can do something else. In other words, a b'diavad can never be asked ahead of time. You can't ask. A b'diavad means, a lot of times we mix up the colloquial expression of b'diavad and the halachic terminology of b'diavad. B'diavad doesn't mean that it's less than ideal. B'diavad means that after I've already done it, now my question is, was I yotzei? Did I fulfill the mitzvah? But there's never a situation where b'diavad means I come ahead of time and say, I know I'm not going to have a shofar, so now can I do something else to fulfill the mitzvah? That's not b'diavad, right? That's not after the fact I'm asking if I can do it. I don't know of a situation. Maybe I'm not thinking it through enough. But I'm trying to think of a situation where, and I could be wrong, it could be there is a situation, but where we say, I know ahead of time I'm not going to fulfill the mitzvah because I'm missing the materials of the mitzvah. So therefore, what can I do to substitute to fulfill the mitzvah, right? I can think maybe of when it comes to Kriyas HaTorah, right? So it comes to Kriyas HaTorah, if my Sefer Torah is pasul, so then the Rambam suggests you could read out of a chumash, right? But the reason why I'm doing that is I'm not fulfilling the mitzvah. I'm not fulfilling the mitzvah on l'chachila or a b'diavad level. All I'm doing is having a zecher to Kriyas HaTorah, so we don't forget the institution of Kriyas HaTorah. But it's not that this is somehow a lower level of fulfilling the mitzvah, right? If I can't fulfill the mitzvah, I can't fulfill the mitzvah. So
Pesach Sheni.
Pesach Sheni is a whole other mitzvah. It's a whole different mitzvah. It's not that and Pesach Sheni is not that I'm lacking the material of the mitzvah. I myself am disqualified from offering the first Korban Pesach, right? It's not that I don't have a Korban Pesach. It's that I myself am not allowed to give the Korban Pesach. So here, when all of a sudden we're saying, okay, the levvim should be the substitute for the Cohanim. So the question you have to ask is, how does a Levi become the substitute? How did that happen? How within the mechanics of this mitzvah, what's the mechanism that allowed us to simply say, we don't have enough Cohanim, let the Leviim do it, okay? And that's now, if you say let the Leviim do it, and that's a valid mechanism, somehow that works to let the Leviim substitute in. So why Leviim? Why all of a sudden are we choosing Leviim? Why not Yisraelim? Because if I can't do it with Cohanim, it's not like we ever have a situation where a Kohen Yom Kippur, a Kohen can't do there's no Kohen to do the avoda on Yom Kippur. Right, so there's no Kohen Gadol and there's no Cohanim that know what they're doing, but some Levi knows what he's doing. So say, okay, Levi, step on in. You go do go into the kosher Kodashim. It doesn't work, right? Leviim are not Cohanim substitutes. They're not their stand-ins, right? Cohanim have one job. Leviim have a different job, which we'll see. So how do Leviim all of a sudden take the role here? So this is a very strange thing that the Rambam says, that all of a sudden, right, we threw in Leviim, right? And that's the Rambam makes sense in terms of Sefer Yoshua, where Rashi says that in Sefer Yoshua, it was the Leviim until this point, but now that we have enough Cohanim, then Yoshua said, okay, we've had enough births, we have enough Cohanim, now we have enough Cohanim to carry the aron and do all the other jobs, so now we're okay. That's a strange thing. Okay, going on here into the Mishnah Torah. Okay, so this is like very strange. I thought for sure I was missing information. I thought I wasn't finding halachos, right? Because the normal time that you see a mitzvah in the Mishnah Torah, so the Rambam has it, he usually has a parak dedicated to that mitzvah, and then a string of halachos that are ascribed to that one mitzvah. And he usually starts off by saying, mitzvahs aseh, to do the following, right? There's a positive command to do the following. Here, it's almost like an afterthought, this mitzvah, right? First of all, the Rambam never lists that there, and in the Mishnah Torah, in the introduction, he lists this mitzvah, but he doesn't in the words of in here in the halachos, he doesn't say there is a mitzvah. He just says when you are walking the aron from place to place, you can't put it on a animal and you can't put it on a wagon, right? So a lot of times we have this misconception that human beings are not the most honorable way that we carry something, right? So where do we see this, right? We have like when it comes to holding the Torah, right? So a lot of times we'll try to substitute a human being for something else, right? You see some congregations have holes built into the bima where you could stand the Sefer Torah, right? So somebody doesn't have to hold it. But it's not true, right? You might think that the most mechubad way, most honorable way of moving the aron is by putting it on a special motorcade, its own dedicated wagon, and that would be the most honorable way of. So that's not true, okay? That it's and David HaMelech was punished because David HaMelech thought that would be true. He thought it would be best if you have it on a wagons, right? So that's then there's the whole nifratz paretz b'uza. Mitzvah not law katef, but rather the mitzvah is to put it on the shoulder. The Rambam says, right? And then he has this interesting thing. I tried figuring out where does this come from. This way of holding it that it's two people facing each other, right? Usually you'd imagine that you're walking it this way, right? And everybody's one in front of the other on both sides, and I'm facing the guy in front of me's back, right? But it's not. It's like they walk like sideways, like this, holding it like this, walking sideways. But it's really logistical. If you think about it, you look at there's no Gemara that says it has to be held this way. It's mostly a logistical issue. Okay, but the one thing that the Rambam leaves out here that he doesn't talk about is he doesn't talk about this whole issue of the Cohanim. In the Sefer Hamitzvos, if you see, he lists inside the definition of the mitzvah, he should see Vanu Shisu HaKohanim ha'aron. He lists that the Cohanim are the ones that are supposed to be carrying the aron. And then when it comes to the Mishnah Torah, he doesn't even talk about this issue of Cohanim and Leviim. So that's very strange. Why doesn't he bring that up? Okay. Going on here. Okay, so then we have remember we talked about the shorashim or the klal and the 14 principles of what counts as a mitzvah and what doesn't count as a mitzvah. So we don't count the mitzvah that isn't noheg l'doros, that isn't customary and obligatory for generations, right? If it's just for Har Sinai or something like that, we don't count it. Yeah, okay. So the aron was placed permanently inside the Beis Hamikdash. So it would seem to be this was a mitzvah that was only limited to the times of the midbar, right? When they were carrying the aron. So how could we have this mitzvah at all? That was our next question. Okay. And the Ramban sort of answers this. He says, he looks at the Baal Halachos because the Baal Halachos took our question and said, yeah, that question's really accurate. So therefore, we shouldn't count this as a mitzvah, right? Because this is so accurate, right? We shouldn't count this as a mitzvah because she'eino noheg, as he says here, ela b'midbar, right? It's only noheg in the desert itself. So if it's only noheg in the desert itself, eina davar kain, aval hi mitzvah noheges b'chol hadoros kol zman shitztarchu levvim laseis machlokes. So the Ramban disagrees and says whenever there was a time that the aron had to be moved, so then this mitzvah was applied. Okay. Then going on, we have here. So we have this whole concept of a mitzvah doesn't change, right? A mitzvah never changes. Okay, the 613 mitzvahs are the 613 mitzvahs. Okay, and you can imagine the Pandora's box that would open up if this wasn't true. Right? If we would say that mitzvahs can change over time, right? So how would we ever know when it could change, when it couldn't change? How a mitzvah, right? So it is a very standard rule. Mitzvahs cannot change. You cannot have the 613 mitzvahs are eternal. They will never change. They have never changed, and they cannot change. And anybody that gets up and says that they have changed, you know right off the bat that they don't know. Either they don't know what they're talking about, or they're lying. So if it's a prophet that comes along and says, "I'm a prophet. God told me this is no longer a command," so you know that person is a false prophet, and we kill that person, right? If Beis Din comes along and says that this mitzvah doesn't apply anymore, as ancient times, it doesn't apply anymore. So then we simply say, no, that's not true. The Torah is not limited to a specific a time period, right? There's no right because that's not a true statement. The Torah's wisdom is eternal. It wasn't built for a specific time period of human history, right? And then when humans either evolve out of that thinking or become better, than the mitzvahs of the Torah change. That's not how it works. The mitzvah's logic is completely eternal, right? So you could have a situation where Beis Din or a Navi changes a mitzvah for a specific time period. If they say it's temporarily changed, okay, that's fine, because there's some emergency situation. They're not suggesting that the Torah changes, right? So okay, fine, great. So that makes sense, except for the fact that this seems to contradict what's happening in our mitzvah, right? In our mitzvah, it seems to be, if we go back to what we were talking about originally, it seems to be that the Cohanim and the Leviim, right, the mitzvah switches from Leviim to Cohanim, right? That seems to be what's happening, right? At least at a superficial level, it seems to be that at one point the Leviim were carrying it. Now, if you look at the Rambam's understanding, so that makes sense. Okay, the Rambam says that it was a temporary solution to a logistical issue that they didn't have enough Cohanim. So the Rambam wasn't suggesting that the mitzvah had changed from Leviim to Cohanim. The Rambam was suggesting that the mitzvah was always Cohanim. It wasn't able to be done the proper way. And then once it was able to be done the proper way, it reverted back to it. But if we don't take the Rambam's approach, right? If we take, let's say here, the Ramban's approach, right? So the Ramban says, no, it wasn't ever for Cohanim, right? Chalil Anus, the Ramban takes it a different approach. He says that no, it wasn't that it switched from Leviim to Cohanim. The mitzvah was never with Cohanim. It was always inclusive of Leviim and Cohanim. That's how it worked. Okay, and the mitzvah was for Leviim. We're always qualified to carry it. And you see the Sefer Hamitzvos says, right? Shekol shevet kasher l'mas aron. That the entire shevet was kosher for it. So our first question is the mitzvah changing, right? Obviously, the answer to that question is no. But then, how do we understand that the mitzvah went from Leviim to Cohanim? And then, when it comes to the Ramban, so it seems to be from the Ramban's perspective, and as if the Ramban was teaching us right now, or if the Sefer Chinuch came up, and the Sefer Chinuch came up and was telling us, okay, let me explain to you. He would say that there's a machlokes between the Ramban and the Rambam. The Rambam holds the mitzvah is Cohanim only. And Leviim the Ramban holds that the mitzvah is inclusive of Leviim as well, right? That's how they would explain it. That it was the Ramban would hold it's Shevet Levi, and the Rambam would hold that it's Cohanim. So, do we have a machlokes in this mitzvah between the Ramban and the Rambam in terms of who can carry the aron? Right, and which would lend to the definition of the mitzvah here, would seem, at least according to the Rambam. Okay, so those were our questions. Okay, so let's look. So I want to build on the svara, and then I want to go over these two halachos, which will help us answer. Okay, actually, first let's do the opposite. Let's go through these halachos and then ask a question here. Okay, so this is the Rambam in Klei Hamikdash. Klei Hamikdash is a series of halachos, right, of the kelim, the vessels, I guess, the utensils that were used in the Beis Hamikdash, right? So different utensils. You had a menorah, you had the shovel that the Kohen used on the avodah on Yom Kippur, right? Different kelim, so they all have different halachos to them. But part of the kelim were actually people. People were kelim, right? How so? So, which is interesting, right? Because you would think, if I would ask you, you have this idea of Cohanim and you have this idea of Leviim. So, where in the Mishnah Torah would you place them? Where would you put them? Where would you discuss their halachos? So you would say there should be halachos of Cohanim and there should be halachos of Leviim, and in there we could talk about the mitzvah of honoring Cohanim, right? And we could talk about the mitzvah of who qualifies as a Kohen and what blemishes disqualify you as a Kohen. And you could talk about the same thing with the Levi, but no, that's not how it works. Leviim and Kohanim are actually subsumed under the same halachos as a menorah, right? They're looked upon as vessels of the Beis Hamikdash, in which case the question becomes, how does that happen, right? How do you take a human being and transform them into a Kli Hamikdash, right? How does a human being become a kli? How did that work? How did that happen, right? So, and you could say something similar. Let's say we had earlier we'd covered the halachos of a Talmid Chacham, right? So there's a mitzvah to honor Talmid Chacham, mitzvah to honor one's Rebbe, right? So there, where are those halachos listed? Those halachos are listed in Talmud Torah, and the reason is because the person that becomes a Talmid Chacham is transformed into a kli of Hilchos Talmud Torah. He is the embodiment of Talmud Torah, right? So he's not a person that happens to have Torah knowledge, but rather he transforms himself into the halachos of Torah, right? He is the living Sefer Torah. He becomes, and therefore, just like you have to honor a Sefer Torah, you have to honor a Rebbe, which is why there's no halachos of a Talmud Chacham. There's halachos of Talmud Torah, which includes the halachos of a Talmud Chacham. So the same thing here is true. So a Talmud Chacham I can understand. How does that happen? Because the Talmud Chacham gains knowledge, right? Let me give one more example. A parent, right? So when it comes to a parent, so how does a human being all of a sudden, right? Remember we talked about the halachos of kibbud avim within the spectrum of the halachos of a Talmud Chacham. So we looked, where is the halachos of kibbud avim, if you remember? So they're in Hilchos Mamrim, right? The halachos of a rebel, right? Of rebellion against the Torah. And the reason why they're put there is because the parent is the kli sort of the Masorah, of the transmission of the Torah. Mamrim is those people that rebel against the Torah, right? So the human being becomes not just a parent, and therefore you have to honor them, but the human being becomes the vessel of the parent. Becomes the human being becomes the vessel of carrying down the Masorah to their children when they parent. Okay, so that's how it works. Okay, so how does a Levi and a Kohen become a Klei HaMikdash? How does that work? So Zera Levi Kula moved Avodas HaMikdash, right? So Nemar Be'esa he hivdil Hashem Shevet Levi. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is mavdil. Okay, this is the verb. Muvdal here is like the noun, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu is hivdil. He separates Shevet Levi. So it's HaKadosh Baruch Hu transforms this entire Shevet. Right, the Shevet when it was born to Yaakov Avinu was nothing. There's no difference between Shevet Levi and Yehuda, right? They're Yehuda's descendants. But at a certain point, the Kadosh Baruch Hu separates Shevet Levi. Right, so they're separated for the avoda in the Beis Hamikdash. That's what they're separated for. So all of a sudden, they take on a new status. They become something different than just a regular human being. They become this Klei HaMikdash that must always be ready to work in the Beis Hamikdash. Bein ratzu, bein shelo ratzu. This isn't like an option. You're not given the opportunity. You are now separated. You now must be separated, and you are because you've become a Klei HaMikdash. Right? Shneimar ba'avad ha'levi hu es avodas ha'moed. Ubei levi shekibel alav kol mitzvos levi. Okay, fine. So that's the Levi. The Cohanim, if you look, this is Parak Gimel, and then here you have this is Parak Daled. Sorry, Abba?
Isn't the language of a little bit unusual? Ben Ratzu, Ben Shelo. The Rambam doesn't say Hilchos Tefillin. Pilachowski, you want to do it, you have no choice. You got to do it.
No, so I think that's the whole point, because the tefillin is a din in the object of the mitzvah. Here we're talking about the person becomes something different, right? A Talmid Chacham can sort of like can leave the area of Chachma, right? He doesn't have to teach, right? He can say, okay, I'm not a Chacham, I'm not qualified. He can deem himself not a Talmid Chacham. Here, a Levi, by dint of your birth, that's it, you're done. Right? I would say it's similar to a Jew. The Jewish people were chosen. Levi is muvdal, right? He's separated from the Jewish people, and that's what we see in this next halacha, right? HaKohanim huvdu michla ha-levvim. So even from within the tribe of the Leviim, there are people in the tribe of the Cohanim that are of Levi, that are separated, and those are the Cohanim. Now, what are they separated for? What makes them any different? La'avodas hakarbanos, okay, for the service of the karbanos. Now, if you remember, when we looked at the mitzvah of raising Kohanim, of lahagdil Kohanim, meaning to honor them, to make them greater, we saw 4 different psukim as to the nature of what makes a Kohen more special, right? So I don't know if you remember this. We saw 4 different things. So here, the Rambam only uses one of them. He says, Shneimar v'yavdil aron lagdisho kodesh kodashim. This is one of our theories. If you remember, we had 4 different theories as to what makes a Kohen special. One of them, for instance, was that the Kohen teaches Torah, right? So the Kohen's unique status was, according to one opinion, was by the fact that their job was to teach Torah throughout the year, right? So here the Rambam takes a different one of the opinions, and he settles on one of the 4, and he says, V'yavdil aron lagdisho kodesh kodashim, right? Meaning that they themselves become kodesh kodashim. They become different than just the Levi, which is separated for avodas hamikdash, to work in the Beis Hamikdash. The Cohanim themselves, the mahut, the nature of the Kohen, becomes different, becomes that he himself is kodesh kodashim. He's a kli that is kodesh kodashim. That's higher up. Okay, that's the ideal. So if I would ask you on a practical level, what's the difference between Levi and Cohanim? So I'd say on a practical level, the Cohanim are able to work with karbanos. Leviim are only able to work inside the Beis Hamikdash in specific jobs. That's practically what separates them. But on a conceptual level, what separates them? Right? In other words, here, if I'm looking here, on a conceptual level, what's the difference between them? So on a conceptual level, I would say that the Levi is set aside to work in the Beis Hamikdash, but he remains a Levi. The Kohen is separated from Shevet Levi, and he himself takes on this new status of Kodesh HaKodashim. He himself is Kodesh HaKodashim. There's a new status to the Kohen. He has a new chalos. He has a new halachic status. That halachic status is that he's Kodesh HaKodashim. And we'll explain what the practical difference is. I mean, one of them we know is that we have to honor him because, right, that's a ramification of his new status, is that he's honored, right, because of this new status. There isn't really a mitzvah of honoring a Levi, right? It's minimal if it's true, and it's only according to some opinions. But when it comes to Kohen, everybody agrees as a mitzvah for Kohen because of this new status. So that's the conceptual difference between the difference between a Levi and a Kohen. Conceptually, is that the Kohen takes on a new chalos of a kodesh kodashim. Okay, so with that, bearing that in mind, okay, so what's the mitzvah of the aron? How can we explain this mitzvah that the aron has to be carried on the shoulders, right? So and again, we want to give a svara here, just on the methodological point here, right? We want to give a svara that's going to be inclusive of all the opinions that we saw. Okay, so that means that our svara has to be inclusive of both. The mitzvah applies to Cohanim and doesn't just apply to Cohanim, right? Understand, right? Because if we include our svara is going to be limited to a Kohen, or limited to the Beis Hamikdash, or not the Beis Hamikdash, or limited or extended all the way to Levi, and doesn't include just Kohanim, so then it's only going to be okay according to the Rambam or the Ramban. We want to find a svara that's expansive enough to include all of the opinions that we saw, but then also enable us to see how within the mitzvah you could have a machlokes in some of the details. Is that clear? No, that's the qualifications of our svara in order to work here. So what I want to say is that the aron itself, the aron HaKodesh, was a kli of the highest sanctity. Okay, and therefore, when it was moved, right, it had to be moved in a manner that was consistent with that nature of the highest sanctity. Okay, that's the mitzvah. The mitzvah, if you'd ask me in one line, what's the nature of this mitzvah? I would say that the nature of the mitzvah is that we move the aron, being of the highest sanctity, has to be moved in accordance with, in a manner that's consistent or compatible with that highest sanctity. Now the question becomes, what does that mean? How do we do that? Okay, so now let's look at our questions. So why the switch from Leviim to Cohanim to carrying the aron, right? So the way we're going to explain it is that ideally, right, Cohanim should be the ones carrying it. That's the most fitting. I'm not talking about b'diavad l'chachila. Now I'm talking about ideally in a halachic sense. Okay, so halachically, the ideal way that this should happen is that those that are considered kodesh kodashim should be moving the kalim of the Beis Hamikdash that themselves are also kodesh kodashim, right? So when you look at the aron and you're saying, okay, this is a kli of the Beis Hamikdash that is of the highest sanctity, so who should be moving this kli of the highest sanctity? The answer to that is, right? That it's those people, the other kli, the kalim, that are able to move it, right? And what is that? That's a kli at the same level. That's the Cohanim. Okay. So how does this work? That if there aren't enough Cohanim, then Leviim were able to carry it. This is the Rambam's right. The Rambam's explanation as to why Leviim were carrying it in the midbar, right? If that's right. So okay. So here we'll explain that it's ideal, right? According to the Rambam, it would be ideal for Cohanim to move it, but it's not a chiyuv for the Cohanim to move it, right? It doesn't have to be moved in the highest sanctity. Right? That's why the pasuk says b'nei kahat, right? The pasuk says b'nei kahat because yes, it has to be moved in a manner that's befitting its kavod, its sanctity, but it's not required that the greatest sanctity, the greatest kalim are move it, right? As long as the ones carrying it are set for avoda in the mikdash, that's enough. That's sufficient to fulfill the mitzvah. So the mitzvah is ideally set aside for Kohanim because that would be the most fitting for its kavod. But it doesn't have to be of the greatest sanctity, the kalim. It doesn't have to be a match of the kalim of the greatest sanctity to the greatest sanctity. That does not have to happen. Okay. Why doesn't the Rambam?
Rabbi, can I so if that's the case, if the Kohanim, Rambam says the ideal is the Kohanim, why in the Sefer Hamitzvos he says the Cohanim should carry it? Like,
see, the only way
that's the ideal, like,
right. The only way you'd be able to explain it is if you said that the Rambam is talking about it in the most ideal form, right? That's the right. Scott's referring to here, where the Rambam. Let's see if we get it. Where I don't know why it's not translated. Here we go. Where the Rambam says Shisu HaKohanim, right? Oh no, I went too far. Okay, so that the Cohanim were the ones that right, that moved the aron, right? So so you have to say that the Rambam is talking about on an ideal level, right? And that's why the Rambam comes along and says, "Afapi shezehat tzivui," even though this is the command, right? And we would insert the words here on an ideal level. Right? So how could it be that we don't do it in the most ideal way, right? So because you didn't have enough Cohanim to do it, and that was the way, but the way we're allowing it to happen, the way we're saying that this isn't a change in the mitzvah or something of that nature, is because we say we're talking about an ideal and a less than ideal way. Okay. Okay, so here, right? So now let's look at this Ramban, because we wanted to know how it could be that that this mitzvah was ledoros, right? How could this mitzvah be counted that it's eternal, right? When it seems to be it's only in the desert, right? So here's something. This is fascinating. Okay, now I think there might be a time when I'm not 100% sure, but I think that if we went to war, right? If we went to war nowadays, as a Jewish people with the command of a king, with the Sanhedrin, in the ideal halachic sense that we went to war as a halachic army, right? So if we had such a thing. There might be a mitzvah, I'm not 100% sure, to bring the aron with us to war, okay? Which opens up the possibility, which is as follows. Although we're never going to really move the aron, right? Although the aron won't be moved, if there's no isser of moving the aron, in other words, it's not that just because the aron is placed in the Beis Hamikdash, it means that the aron doesn't move, right? It means that the chances are we're not going to move the aron. But the aron is open to being moved. It's not that there's a chiyuv to keep it stationary inside the Kodesh Kodashim. The aron is mobile. It's by definition a mobile object. It's not built into the floor of the Beis Hamikdash. In fact, the second Beis Hamikdash didn't even have an aron, right? It's buried right where it is today. It's still buried in Har Bayis somewhere, right? So if you have, right, the aron is open to be moved.
What you're saying is. So what you're saying is, if there needs to be on the floor below the Aron Kodesh, you have to call in the crew of Cohanim in order to move the Aron Kodesh so that they can do maintenance on the floor.
Right. So we're saying is that for whatever reason, what we're saying is since the aron is open to be moved, right? It can be moved. So at any point that you're going to move the aron, the way it must be moved is on the shoulders. Ideally by Cohanim, but definitely somebody from Bnei Kahat, right? That's how the mitzvah operates. So it's not that we're saying that this mitzvah can't work after they build the Beis Hamikdash. Yes, it's unlikely that we ever have a situation where this is going to happen, but that doesn't mean that the mitzvah is not eternal, right? Because the mitzvah still applies today. The mitzvah is if we wanted to move the aron today, so how would we do it? We would have to do it on our shoulders, right? It could be that the time for the mitzvah never happens, and there are mitzvahs like this. There are mitzvahs that they might never happen, right? Most famous case, Ben Soromora, right? The rebellious son, right? So even though the mitzvah might never happen, it doesn't mean that the mitzvah is not eternal, right? It just means that for right now, right, there's no possibility of the mitzvah happening. But that does not mean that the mitzvah isn't possible. So that's an important point in terms of the understanding of what it means for a mitzvah to be ledoros, right? Just to expand on that for a minute, the Rambam had written that the reason why a mitzvah has to be ledoros, right? If you look at here, he says karu morasha kihilas Yaakov, a mitzvah she'eino nohegos ledoros eino lanu morasha. The nature of mitzvahs in the Torah is a fascinating line by the Rambam, is that they have to be by nature, the Torah, the mitzvahs have to be something that can be passed down from generation to generation. So you can't pass down a mitzvah that's not relevant to the next generation, because you can't pass something down that that next generation is not going to be able to use, right? That's the idea of a mitzvah. So there's really two ways of understanding what a mitzvah is. A mitzvah is either a command that exists in the abstract, or a mitzvah that exists in the practical. What the Rambam is saying is that a mitzvah by nature has to be practical. In which case you look at certain mitzvahs and say, well, those are by nature, they're not practical. No, it's not true. The definition of practical, what that means to be a practical mitzvah, means that there's a possibility of it being done, right? That's the definition. That's what it means for something to be practical. Okay, how did the mitzvah change from Cohanim and to Leviim? So now we understand it's not changing, right? Because there was always the open possibility for Leviim to carry it, right? So in this case, now the question is there a machlokes between the Ramban and the Rambam, right? So no, so I would say that no, I'd say that the Sefer Chinuch has it wrong and the Ramban has it wrong in the understanding of the Rambam. As crazy as it is that that nobody's coming up along and saying this, but I really think that they didn't understand what the Rambam was saying, right? The Rambam wasn't saying that there's a mitzvah dafka with the Cohanim, because I don't understand how, if you go to the Sefer Chinuch and you go to the Ramban and say, how do you understand the Rambam as having him changing the mitzvah? How do you explain that? The only way I understand the Rambam, according to the Rambam's principles, that mitzvahs can't change, right, is by saying that the Leviim were always able to carry the aron, right? That they was always open to Bnei Kahat, but that's not ideal, right? That's not the ideal. So it wasn't that when the Rambam wrote that only that Cohanim, the mitzvahs for Cohanim to carry it on their shoulders, and that means that the mitzvah by definition must be done by Cohanim. That part of the nature of the mitzvah is that it can only be done by Cohanim. That's not what's happening. What we're saying is that the mitzvah ideally should be done by Cohanim because they are Kodesh Kodashim, and the aron is on that level, that status, and therefore it's befitting the aron to move. But that doesn't mean that the nature of the mitzvah requires it to be Cohanim that move it. It could also be open to Leviim. So the Rambam would look at the Ramban, I think, and he would say, no, we're not arguing. We're looking at the same way. The mitzvah expands itself to allow that Bnei Kahat, but in the ideal way, how should it be done? The cover of the aron should be as such that it's only moved by the kalim of the Beis Hamikdash that are Kodesh Kodashim, meaning the Cohanim. But it's open and it's allowed for Leviim to carry it as well. That's how I think we do it, and then there would be no machlokes between the Cohanim and the Leviim. That's how I would see it. So I think that's the mitzvah. And that's all I got. Okay. So, B'li Neder, we will see each other next week and hopefully during the week in terms of a shiur, an introductory shiur. I'll try B'li Neder to get it before Friday this week. Okay. Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye, guys.